And one of the things that I would want to tell someone early in their career is understand how your company makes money and how what you do every day relates to that.
Hey, my name is Felix Tia. I'm the host of the Culture of Code, where we invite experienced and successful tech industry leaders like software engineers, product managers, engineering managers to reveal exactly what they've learned about growing and succeeding in the tech industry. In this episode, we have Shaun Hickson, engineering manager at Google, managing foundational technical infrastructure at Google and Google Cloud. Welcome, Shaun.
Hey, Felix, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, excited to have you on. So I gave a very quick introduction about your role, but can you tell us a little bit more about what you do in your day-to-day and what your team's in charge of?
Sure. So my team is in charge of what we call key store at Google. So basically, we manage all of the infrastructure that handles cryptographic keys within Google. And so that's both for internal Google tools as well as the cloud KMS system is built on top of our infrastructure. So it's super high volume. And the thing that keeps me up at night is if we have an outage, then Google has an outage. So it's exciting and scary kind of in that way. And a lot of our time is spent making sure that we have all of the right automation in place and we have the right people thinking about things to make sure that that never happens.
Yeah, it's definitely at a scale that I think a lot of people might not have access to or not currently have access to kind of see what it's like to operate on concerns like security, latency, reliability at such a large scale. Did you have kind of warm up or ramp up to this from previous roles, or was this kind of this is a scale that you've never seen before? Tell us more about how you kind of adapted to taking on such a big responsibility.
Sure. I'm not sure there are many places with this scale, right? So it's one of these things that ultimately you get thrown in. And look, I say I get thrown in, right? Like there's obviously a team of very experienced people, some of whom have spent a lot of time building this infrastructure, right? So I think a big part of being a good engineering leader and having a good engineering culture is making sure that there aren't single points of failure, right? So if you drop a new manager into a incredibly important system like this, it makes it hard for anything to go wrong. And that's definitely something that the team had before I got here. In terms of where I had worked previously, I had done some high volume stuff I worked for the TJX companies for a long time. They own TJ Maxx, Marshall's, Home Goods. So I did a lot of internal systems work there. So I'd been building systems and thinking about systems for a long time, but nothing quite at this scale. And then immediately prior to Google, I worked at AWS. And so there got exposed to a lot of teams that were building systems like this, but I myself was working in the developer tools and SDK space there. So we got to talk to a lot of people who were building planet scale systems like this. And of course, spent time thinking about how to make sure that we were enabling that stuff, but wasn't really thinking about systems at this scale.
Yeah, and when you do step into a role where, like you mentioned before, kind of planet-size scale problems that you're trying to solve, how do you approach the problems differently than when you didn't have those kind of concerns before? Do you ask different questions, or you kind of pay attention to different things? Like, what is the experience like?
I think onboarding into any job is somewhat similar regardless of scale, right? You want to understand like what are the things that keep people up at night who have been on the team for a while, right? What are the things that they are worried about? What are the things that they are very confident in? What are the things that have been going well for the team? And what are the things that have been going poorly for the team? And I think from that, that's how I always try to approach developing an action plan when coming into a new role. And I think that's applicable whether you're an engineer or an engineering manager or anything like that, right? You want to understand. And I think with some of those things too, you're not just interested necessarily in the raw metrics, you're interested in the rate of change of those metrics, right? Like maybe there's a number that like taken on its own value isn't great, but it's been getting a lot better over the course of the last year. Okay, well then I want to make sure that the team keeps doing what it's doing on that, right? Like, latency is an example. If you have a system with bad latency, but it's gotten better by a factor of 2 over the past year, then you probably don't need to intervene there, right? If you come in and you have a system with okay latency, but it's gotten worse by a factor of 2 over the past year, then that's probably really something that you want to spend your first 30 days diving into and understanding like why the rate of change is heading in a negative direction.
Yeah, it's a good point that you can't always just look at the metrics and like kind of static isolation, but the rate of change is just as important. One thing you mentioned that was interesting to me is you try to identify what the team's doing well or what's doing well, what the team's confident in, and versus what's maybe needs more attention or that's performing, let's say, poorly. How do you decide whether to kind of double down on what's already working versus fixing things that are kind of weak spots? And this might be different, I guess, if you're kind of more infra role, maybe versus product role, but what's your experience here between doubling down on what's working versus fixing and kind of getting everything else caught up that's not kind of, so let's say, the bar?
Sure. I will say that in general, my inclination in coming into a new role is to spend a lot more time listening than talking in the first 30, 60, 90 days, right? Like maybe the amount of talking versus listening will ramp up gradually over that time. But like mainly I want to understand, like, presumably, unless you're coming into a situation that's a real disaster, you're coming into a team that has been together for a while. Or like if you're building a brand new team, that's obviously a different problem. But if you're coming into a team that exists, presumably they're doing the things they're doing for a reason. So I think it's really important to come in and understand not just what they're doing, but why they're doing it. And in some cases, I think you'll find, oh, okay, they were doing this because there was 5 years ago, there was a process problem that they solved by putting these daily stand-up meetings in place. And we don't have that process problem anymore. So let's get rid of the daily stand-up meetings. People don't like them. We're in different time zones, right? But sometimes you'll come in and maybe your first instinct is, oh boy, I would never set up things this way. But then you find out that like, oh, this meeting is here, or this reporting structure is here for a very good reason. And that reason is still in place and we want to maintain it, right? Like we have, again, speaking hypothetically here, we have a status meeting with this other team once a week because there's like a circular dependency there that's really complicated. And we always need to make sure that we're in sync on things and we aren't going to break each other, right? So not just understanding what the team is doing and how that aligns with how I would set things up in the abstract, but understanding why they're doing it and if those factors are still at play.
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize that this kind of curiosity or this like almost humility when you're coming
Yeah.
into a new team is not always natural for a lot of people, where you could bring baggage from your old company where you're like, oh, why are you doing it this way? We used to do it this way in my old place, and like bring a lot of that on board. Did you ever have to did you have to work on this kind of curiosity, this humility, or did you just kind of naturally have? Any advice you have here for anyone that's changing teams, changing companies, and wanting to come in with a much more kind of more listening versus kind of talking kind of mindset?
Yeah, sure. I think it's very natural, right? If you're at a place for a while, or if you're at a very senior role at a place, even for a little while, that you produce value by having strong opinions and like you're there because, oh, we want you to steer the ship. And I absolutely, in some situations, had trouble getting out of that mindset and realizing that, like, okay, no, what I learned there is going to be valuable to me and it's valuable background information. And I've developed tools and skills and processes that I may want to bring here. But first, digging in, and yes, I think that's very unnatural for a lot of people because you get successful by having strong opinions, by like taking bold stances, by leading initiatives, and to come in and step back and listen is a hard transition to make. I will say that as I've worked on developing that skill, I find myself doing that more and more and more, right? And I think that when you look at the people who are really successful leaders, and when I look at people I've worked with at Amazon and Google and other places who are really successful leaders, they're the ones who in meetings, they're not necessarily talking the most, right? They're sitting back, they're listening, they're taking in information. And if they need to make a decision, they'll make a decision based on the information they have. But they're the best leaders. I think they lead by pushing the decision down as far in the org as it can be made, right? Like let the people who have the context and the information and are close to the implications of the decision, let them own the decision and make it.
Yeah, I think this is a really important topic, especially for someone that's newer in their career, where you mentioned that a lot of the best leaders aren't spending much time talking, they're spending more time absorbing and listening. But on the other hand, you kind of see people that advance far in their career by being opinionated. These are things that we just talked
Sure.
about. How do you kind of find the balance? Let's say, especially as someone that is maybe more naturally introverted or more naturally interested in learning and absorbing and kind of thinking or mulling over their decision rather than always having strong opinions right out of the gate. Can that impact your
Sure.
career? Like, how do you balance between these two kind of, I guess, modalities?
Yeah, I think there's a factor that I think is out of our individual control to some extent here, which is what kind of company are you at? Are you at the kind of company where the person who talks loudest and last is going to get to make the decision? Or are you at the sort of company where, like, okay, so you have a meeting about a topic and then the person who goes off and writes the most thoughtful one-page document proposing a step forward, where that's going to get adopted? And I think as someone newer in their career, as someone who's, not as senior in an org, it's hard to change those things, but I think you can always influence them, right? You can always work with your direct manager. And I would always encourage people to be very direct with their immediate manager to say, like, hey, this is how I work. I'm an introvert. I don't like talking in big meetings. I prefer to have a couple of hours to think about something and write an email describing my feelings on it. And if your manager is good, again, something that maybe you don't have a ton of control over, they will work with you and they will work to amplify your voice and make sure that your voice is getting heard and that you're part of the decision-making process for the things that you have a lot of expertise and context on.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point about how a lot of these things are out of your control, where especially the kind of culture that the company has. And speaking of culture, prior to, I guess, a few jobs ago now, you worked at TJX, which we mentioned is, I
Yep.
guess, a parent company of TJ Maxx, Marshalls, Home Goods, which is not known for having a tech culture, but you
Yeah.
wanted to kind of change things there. Tell us more about your experience there and kind of bringing the kind of digital transformation over to these kind of companies.
Yeah, I mean, I had the chance to work there on a lot of interesting projects. And as I grew more senior as an individual contributor there, I had the opportunity to get in the room with VPs and folks who were making decisions to shift from more of a project driven culture to a product driven culture, thinking about rather than okay, so some business area has decided they want a system that tracks markdowns on clothes more efficiently. And they write up a 300-page doc and fax that over to a business analyst who sits near an engineering team. And they take the fax and hand it to the developers. The developers go build it for 12 months and come back and, oh, hey, that's not what we wanted at all, right? I mean, we've all, well, those of us who've been in the industry long enough have all experienced projects like that, to something where the folks who have the business need are more embedded with the software teams who are building it, right? And I don't mean they're sitting next to them and talking every day, but where there's an ongoing relationship there and it's not purely transactional of like, okay, I got funding from the company for this project. Part of that is I get allocated a development team. I don't ever want to talk to that development team. I don't ever want to be in the same room as that development team. But like where folks are actively engaging, looking at prototypes, giving feedback along the way, all of the stuff I feel like agile is one of those things that has over the past 20 years maybe taken on some negative connotations, and there's a bit of a, I think some places that's not a good word anymore, but I mean this is ultimately what agile was initially, right? Was getting away from the model of a multi-hundred page spec getting faxed over and then a year later getting a product that didn't match the spec at all, right? To have that sort of active iteration, the conversation, the partnership, I think that's part of what we were able to achieve at TJX that was really interesting.
Yeah, in some regards, this kind of effort that you put in is almost harder than solving some of these technical problems, because I'm assuming that there's probably teams or lots of people on teams that either thrived or that saw a lot of career advancements in the existing style of, let's say, projects kind of
Sure.
led style. So how did you, I guess, get buy-in or even help that transition for people that are just have spent maybe years or maybe a decade in this older way that you wanted to transition them away from?
Yeah, if you're at a point in your career, this is probably not something that an entry level eng can pull off necessarily, right? But if you've been at a place for a while and you have some organizational credibility established because you've delivered on your projects and you've met your commitments, you're going to start to get exposed to folks who are more senior leaders in your team. And I think people also, you can develop the sense for, as new senior leaders come in, whether that's internally or externally, who's interested in these sorts of things, right? And I think one of the things that folks don't tend to understand is most senior leaders, these are not people who are aloof. They want to talk to people who are doing the day-to-day work, right? So if there's a new VP of engineering at your company and you hear them say in an all hands meeting, hey, I want to introduce this new process, or I want to build systems using a new approach, send them an email, right? Like ask for a one-on-one, go talk to them, tell them like, hey, I'm interested in this. And I think by like building those relationships, and look, is that going to work every time? No. But I think a good portion of the time, those folks would love to have a meeting with someone who's actually on the ground doing the work and who can help them build their own credibility for the changes they want to implement within the org, right? Because I think it's tough. The thing that it's easy to miss is a VP of engineering can come in and say, hey, I have this grand new approach. But if you're just trying to impose that top down, it's a lot harder than if you have some folks sprinkled within the org who are really interested and committed to that new approach, who want to spread that change, right? And I worked for a while for an agency that was building systems for Ford, and it was really interesting there. They were going through the same sort of thing as they were looking to build a flagship mobile application where there were people who'd been Ford IT forever, right, who just wanted to keep doing what they were doing. But there were, 10, 20 people throughout their IT organization who were really interested in shifting to product-driven development and who were having reading groups to read the lean startup and figure out how they could like bring that sort of startup culture to a big corporate IT department. And they made progress along the way, right? And it's not going to happen overnight, and there's going to be some successes and some failures, but get involved in those decisions. Find the people who are above you in the org chart who want to enact the same kind of change you do and build relationships with them.
Yeah, so we've spent a lot of time talking about this from the perspective of, let's say, the person on the right side of history at these companies. And what you got yourself with a lot of your success is having this kind of learner's mindset. So for someone on the other side where they want to avoid kind of getting caught like flat-footed and recognizing, wow, with the world, the tech industry is changing, or has changed so much since I've entered here. I've been kind of stuck in this role, or that I've been stuck at this company, and all of a sudden I'm kind of doing it the old way or less effective way. How do you prevent that from happening to yourself? How do you make sure that you're always kind of on top of the new methodologies, let's say Agile when it first came out, or any other kind of new styles that are coming out now, and making sure that you're always attuned to it?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. And it's something that I don't know that I have the best answer right now, because it's one of these things. Fundamentally, you mentioned learner's mindset, right? And I think that is the absolute baseline foundational element to this. Understand that you should always be learning. You want to maintain mental agility, right? Not agile in the sense of software development, but you want to always be thinking about how can we be doing things differently? And look, we live in an era of unlimited information that is available to us, whether it's podcasts or YouTube courses or massive online courses that you can take, right? You can get any sort of information you want. And I know like back in 2003, 2004, I was looking at Slashdot a lot, right? And I was looking at Hacker News is certainly something that still exists where you can sort of just like see what people are doing. But read the product blogs from companies who are doing things that you find interesting, right? Like a lot of companies are pretty open about what they're doing. Like if you look at the Amazon Builders Library or Google Cloud Library, you can find a lot of information from people who built these really foundational systems that the internet runs on. You can learn about how those are built. And I think it's the same sort of thing if you're more interested in building front end or more product driven things. The information is out there. Use your favorite search engine and get out there and keep an open mind and set aside some time for yourself to learn a new language or learn a new framework or brush up on your computer science fundamentals, which is something that I think we can all benefit from. And just always be learning.
Yeah, and you mentioned your fundamentals, and I think one interesting thing is that you've only been in the industry for a little bit over a decade, but even in that time, you kind of see this cycle of things coming back around that were a just a slight variation or a different flavor of something that was already here before. So how do you make sure that you are not caught in this kind of shiny object syndrome versus like actually recognizing that there's a paradigm shift or a brand new technology that's about to take over the world that's actually worth investing in? Because we see this a lot right now, right? Where there's a bunch of like a big kind of AI craze right now where
Yep.
a lot of people are unsure, is this just like some other fad or craze that's happening, or is it something real that I should invest and shift my whole career towards?
Yeah, and I think the closer you can get to learning about the fundamentals of a technology, the more valuable and sustainable that's going to be. If rather than like sure, you learn how to use a new web framework, but maybe also try to go under the hood and learn like how web frameworks work in general, right? And then through that understand, okay, so we put that HTTP colon slash slash at the beginning of a web, learn more about like what HTTP is. I think the farther down you get in learning fundamentals, the more persistent it is. So I would say like with AI, right? You could probably take a course that is like delving into a very specific large language model that maybe is the new hotness today that won't be in use 2 years from now. Or you can take the Andrew Ng Coursera course and learn some of the math behind AI and machine learning, which is, I think, absolutely going to be relevant in 5 years, right? Like there will be systems built using that if you learn that. So I think focusing on those sort of foundational elements and learning core concepts, whether that is in systems or AI or web programming, but the closer you get to the foundations, the more persistent value that's going to offer you.
So you worked at a lot of large companies, obviously at Google now, but you also mentioned earlier that you worked at an agency which was building the Ford's like flagship mobile application. Tell us more about that kind of transition from working at a tech department inside a company to now an agency. Like how drastic was that transition?
Yeah, it was really interesting because I left TJX because I moved to Austin, Texas. I just wanted to make a change in my life. So I moved from Massachusetts, where I lived my whole life, down to Austin. And a few months after I moved down there, I got a call from a guy I worked with 10 years before saying, "Hey, I just started working at this agency. You should come work with us. It's interesting stuff." And that for me was a real shift, because it was the first time in a long time where I had been thrown into the deep end of learning myself. That was my first time building something on a cloud system. They were using Microsoft Azure. It was my first time like really using Spring Boot. Like, so there's all these sort of like, as someone who had been writing Java production code for a while, it was my first time being thrown into a lot of new stuff. And I had been always learning, always keeping an eye on these things, but it was my first time like actually using this stuff on the job. And it was really interesting. And I think what I liked about agency life and what I really valued about that experience was the opportunity to wear so many hats, right? Like at a big company, even a non-tech company, right? Like I had the chance to be in some interesting conversations and help make some big decisions. But ultimately, my main job was to serve as a tech lead for teams that were building software components for core systems in this company. At an agency, it was like, oh, today I have to put on my sales hat, right? I have to go do a pre-sales call and like throw together a demo overnight of what we could do for this company. Ford was our biggest client, but there were other clients as well, right? Or, hey, we're going to spend the afternoon pulling a few people into a room to put together a pitch for this other client. Or, hey, look, this thing we built for Ford doesn't work. We need someone to fly out to Detroit to get in a room with the executives to sort of walk through what the path forward is going to be. So it was really interesting there, because all of those things, they might not be directly applicable to like working in a big company, but gosh, there are some analogs, right? Like that ability to get in the room with executives and talk to them about, hey, look, this broke. Here's what we're going to do to fix it. Here's going to be the next status update we're going to give. It's all super applicable to like whether you're a senior IC or an engineering leader at a big company. You need to develop those skills. And it was a really interesting way to sort of get an accelerated version of developing some of those skills and getting to wear a variety of different hats.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be lots of fun and lots of growth too. And speaking about how if you can be in the kind of right environment that meets your needs or matches with your values, how would you identify, or who do you think should not be working at a tech consulting agency, especially since all the stuff you detail now seem vastly different than the typical, I guess, career path, the typical day to day that an engineer working at a large tech company would encounter?
Yeah, I think, look, if you're someone who wants to just pull Jira tickets off a queue or choose your bug management system of choice and just implement features, then working at an agency, I think it's probably closer. I've never worked at a true startup, but I think it's closer to that startup life of like, hey, here's what we need to do to get through the week, guys. So we're going to do it, right? And hey, Jill, you're going to go do this for the week. And maybe that's something you've never done before, but you're going to have the ability to develop that skill set overnight and then make your best attempt at doing it. And I think that if that's not something that you're interested in, if you're more comfortable with just like, yeah, I want someone to tell me what code to write and then I'm going to write it and test it and do that well, probably not the best fit for being at an agency or being at a startup.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when you were at this agency, I'm not sure how your agency works specifically, but I know of agencies that have a big emphasis on like this concept of billable hours, actually like being able to detail all the things that you did. Was that your experience too? Like how stressful or how unstressed were you about that, the way that the work was accounted for?
Sure. This was different than that. I think that's more like a body shop consulting firm. We were the tech arm of a creative agency. So, I mean, ultimately, they came from the advertising world and the marketing world, and they had built out a tech practice that went along with that. So this was more like billing by the project. We were there to provide services to the client. It wasn't about like counting hours in a week or anything, which I don't think I would enjoy that model. This was great because it really did like, the question that we were asking ourselves every day was like, are we doing the thing that is providing the most value to the clients? And maybe that is going off and thinking about something for half a day, right, before implementing it, which I think if you're in the model more of like the billable hours type of shop, that's not really something you're able to spend a lot of time doing.
I guess maybe similarly to that question is, it sounds like your experience at different jobs have put you in roles where you working at like a profit center versus like maybe a cost center. And maybe the agency was more kind of cost center side. Maybe your job now at Google is more kind of profit center side. And, would love to hear if you have a different opinion there. But in your experience, like, how does the job change when you are seen as a profit center role versus a cost center role?
Yeah, it's a great point. I was thinking before hopping on with you today about things that I would want to tell someone earlier in their career. And one of the things that I would want to tell someone early in their career is understand how your company makes money and how what you do every day relates to that. Because I think definitely changes changes the company's perspective on what you do, but it also helps you understand how you fit in the larger puzzle, right? Like at TJ Maxx or at TJX, we were absolutely like IT was a valued partner, I'm sure they would say, but it absolutely was not how they made money. The secret sauce at TJX was having this army of buyers who would go off around the world and find stuff to buy really cheaply and then get it back and sell it for a profit, right? And there was this VP I worked with at TJX who, whenever we would get too in the weeds in a technical discussion, would say, remember, guys, we're selling shirts at a discount. That's how we make money, right? And it was always good to keep that in mind, right? That like, yes, there are interesting technical problems that come along with that. But at the same time, like, it's not a tech company. And we're there to serve the needs of these other folks who are making money for the company. At the agency, I think it was a mix. This project was a big project for them. At the same time, the tech arm is probably a bit of a loss leader for the creative work they were trying to do, land creative accounts, right? So it was a bit of a mix. And I think at Google, it's somewhat similar, right? Google makes its money through ads and selling cloud services. We certainly enable the selling of cloud services. So in that way, we're a profit center. But there's also an element of what we do that, and I think we provide a lot of value because Google has a lot of security commitments to its customers in terms of data encryption and stuff, which we enable them to meet. But at the same time, it's not like no one is paying money to use our system, right? Like we are still ultimately something that it's internal infrastructure that is somewhere in between overhead and profit for them.
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of conundrum because somebody has to do the jobs of like the kind of
Yep.
cost center, the stuff that like I guess is a form of support for the actual revenue generating parts of the business. For someone that was thinking about their career longevity, especially when there's a lot of fears around like layoffs and the economy taking a downturn, especially in the tech industry, there's a lot of advice about okay, move closer towards the money making parts, move closer towards the profit centers. Given the time that your career you've had where you've seen the ups and downs, how, I guess, valid is that advice? Is it a good advice to start thinking about your career in that way, to always try to move closer and closer to where the money is being made?
I think it's complicated, right? I think that, yes, if you're at a non-tech company, I'd probably want to be as close to how the money is being made as possible. I'd much rather be building in-house, like, again, using the hypothetical example of TJX, this isn't anything I actually experienced, right? I'd much rather be writing software that supports the buyers than be writing software that supports HR, right? Like one of those things is much closer to how the company is making money than the other. And in an environment of economic uncertainty, I'd rather be closer to how the money is being made. I do think, though, that there's another angle, which is like working on things that are really hard problems and really complicated. There's some value there as well, right? Like the people who are doing the cutting edge AI work, the people who are doing the cutting edge distributed systems work, that's also stuff that's like hard to do that in a different way other than like hiring experts and letting them do their thing. So I think if you can find a way to carve out a niche doing those things, that's also a way. It might not be a profit center, but it's also something that it's a lot harder to replace folks who do that stuff easily.
Yeah, I guess the answer then is that it's not always black and white. There's kind of a couple levers that you can pull to make yourself like it's marketable or desirable or valuable
Yeah.
within a company. So that makes sense. And speaking of kind of charting your own career, kind of attribute some of the setbacks in your career to not knowing or not articulating your goals or your desires. Tell us more about those experiences. How have you overcome those and gotten better at that?
Yeah, I think for a long time early in my career, I expected that part of my manager's job was to tell me like, okay, hey, you've been doing a great job. Here's a promotion. We're giving you more responsibility. Like you're now going to work on something more interesting. And then I got frustrated when that didn't necessarily happen, right? When every year I would get hey, like great work this year, a modest pay increase and keep doing what you're doing, right? And go, gosh, like, don't they realize that I could be doing much more than this? And the answer is that, right, like, sure, part of your manager's job, and if you have a good manager, they should be proactively like trying to pull this out of you and understand what you're doing. But ultimately, their job is to deliver projects, to like keep the business running, and to like deal with urgent issues that come up, right? Like whether that's coaching someone who's underperforming or dealing with budget issues or something. And if you want to be doing something different than what you're doing, especially early in your career, the best way to achieve that is to have a very direct conversation. And when I say direct, I'm not trying to use that as code for like rude or threatening or anything, right? I just mean like, be clear about your goals with your manager, because then they can help you achieve them, right? If you say, there's this team over here that's working on a technology that I'd like to learn, and they're building systems that I think are interesting, or I really want to dive more into web programming, and there's this team over here that's doing that. A good manager will work with you to find opportunities for you to engage in those things, whether that's maybe spending part of your time doing that, or a role transfer or something. And in the same way, at every company, I think there's usually a certain line over which you're expected to make it to a certain level. And then above that, it's not necessarily part of the natural progression, right? So you go from, let's say, junior to mid-level to senior. And then if you want to go to staff or principal, that's something that you actually have to expend effort doing. And so if your goal is to become a staff or a principal engineer, have that conversation with your manager early and let them know that that's your goal. And then they can help you try to like talk to the right people and figure out what the path is to that. Because it's one of those things where you should be thinking about that a few years. You don't want to be thinking about making that leap 6 months before you want to make it, right? You want to be thinking about that a couple of years before you want to make it, so that you can make sure that you're getting the right sized projects and getting the right organizational visibility, right? A lot of companies, if you want to make it to that staff or principal level, that's ultimately a decision that the VP has to at least agree with, even if they aren't making the decision. So you want that person to know your name. You don't want them to hear your name for the first time in the meeting where your manager is trying to suggest that you should get promoted to principal engineer. So work with your manager to find opportunities to get you interesting projects and visibility in the org.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest fallacies that I've had in my career was this belief that the ones that are above you in management are omniscient, where they know everything about what you're thinking, what the org needs. And someone over at Stripe, where I work, publishes internal blog post that says something to the effect of the reason why we're working on Project A when you're thinking that Project B is so much more important than Project A is because you're the only one thinking about Project B and no one else knows about it. Sometimes you're the only one that knows. And especially when it comes to your career and your desires, like you're the only one that truly knows, and believing that other people know too is kind of the biggest like pitfall that you can fall into. So a lot of your advice definitely is resonating with me. And we'd love to kind of close this out with just like, what would you say is kind of the most common misconception or myth about your particular role as like an engineering manager at Google that either you had or that other people at Google have or outside of Google have about what you do, what your role is like, that is just simply not true?
Sure. I mean, I would say that when I looked at my early career, which is, working at non-tech companies, I think the biggest difference between being a manager at a company like that and being a manager in my last couple of roles at AWS and in Google is the amount of autonomy and self-direction that's required for a manager at Google, like whether that's someone who is like in their first role as a manager leading 4 people, or whether that's someone who's like my team's about 20 at this point, right? You're expected to define the roadmap for that team and deal with the issues that come up there without any intervention. Like in the same way that like my manager's not going to come to me and say like, oh, it seems like there's an interpersonal conflict on your team. You should get that sorted out. Or, hey, like you should think about this problem, right? Like the expectation of a manager at these kinds of companies, and I think Stripe is similar, right? Is that you're serving as like the leader for your area and the folks that you're there, and you should be working or getting the right people thinking about the product roadmap and organizational structure and all of these things, and you should be presenting those to your leadership chain as solutions and not as questions, right? I think that a lot of companies that aren't as focused on technology, there's an expectation that a line manager's role is to like just sort of take orders down the hill, deliver them, and then sort of deliver results back up the hill, right? And I think that what I found really eye-opening about working at both Amazon and Google is the fact that the amount of empowerment and freedom that I have to define the role, but also the amount of like responsibility and accountability that comes along with that.
Yeah, I've always said this too about my experience where I've worked at companies where it's kind of more top down, and not working at a company that is more kind of bottom up is a big learning curve, and you kind of have to unlearn a lot of things about there's nothing, you can stand there and wait all day for things to come, but it's not going to come when you're working at a company that's more bottom up. So yeah, the empowerment definitely comes with a big learning curve to understand how to actually recognize that you're empowered and recognize that you can and are expected to use that empowerment. So thank you so much for your time. Again, Shaun Hickson, engineering manager at Google. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your advice and your journey and your experience with us.
Felix, it's been great chatting with you. Thank you so much for having me on.
And that's all the time we have for this episode. Come join us next time on the Culture of Code. Again, my name is Felix Tia. Take care.